Seth Rogen's Sausage Party condenses the history of organized religion, along with its fraught complexities, critiques, as well as its potential to divide rather than unite, into a neatly packaged, sexually outrageous adult comedy. The film is set in a suburban grocery store on the eve of the 4th of July, where sentient foods eagerly await to be chosen by humans who are regarded as gods in the film. These gods hold the ultimate power, deciding which foods get to leave the store. And so the story follows Frank and Carl, two sausages whose initial excitement about being purchased quickly dissolves once they discover the horrifying truth about what awaits them outside the store. This great beyond, which they have been taught to see as a heavenly afterlife, is in fact a cruel illusion, an invention by the non-perishables designed to comfort the other foods and hide the gruesome reality of their fate. The movie therefore opens an interesting discussion about the nature of fiction, why it's created, the quest for the truth, the mass reaction and rejection to the truth, and finally, a gradual and strained acceptance of it. But before I begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel. After witnessing Honey Mustard's suicide, an act prompted by his traumatic return from the great beyond, Frank becomes determined to uncover what lies beyond the store's walls. As Frank continues in his quest for the truth in the second half of the film, he comes across the non-perishables, who assume the role of the wise village elders. After initially trying to silence Frank's curiosity, they cave and tell him the truth. The great beyond is a lie, a false reality constructed by the non-perishables who lived during a dark age when all foods were aware of the violent deaths that awaited them at the hands of humans. This period of food history was filled with constant panic, anxiety, and fear, and so the non-perishables constructed the fantasy of the great beyond, a utopian afterlife modeled after heaven, where every food lives in bliss after they are purchased by the humans. This meant that the foods now look forward to being purchased, over time equating self-worth with how likely they were to being picked off the shelves. And in order to reinforce this fantasy, the non-perishables go as far as to compose the Great Beyond song, a hymn sung every morning by the foods as a way to reaffirm their belief in the gods and the Great Beyond. The first verse is as follows: Dear God, we pledge our love to you forevermore. We always felt we had a special bond, so take us to the Great Beyond, where we're sure nothing bad happens to food. The construction of the myth of the Great Beyond opens up a question. How did the foods living in the Dark Ages come to readily accept the myth of the Great Beyond despite knowing the truth? After all, how can you believe in something you know to be false? Well, we can assume one of three things. First, fear and denial. The foods may have been so horrified by the truth that they collectively embraced the comforting illusion of the Great Beyond to keep despair at bay. The second option is that they had no option but to accept the lie. I mean, we can see how ruthless Firecracker, one of the elder non-perishables, can be, ensuring truth speakers are eliminated from the pack. At the start of the film, he threatens a traumatized Honey Mustard to remain silent about his experience in the Great Beyond. Firecracker also attempted to kill Frank, who comes to the elders with a half-painted picture of the truth, until Twinkie mercifully intercedes on his behalf. With his potential for dictatorship and murder in mind, we can assume that Firecracker gave the foods a choice. Accept a lie or be killed, until only those remained that were too scared or weak to cross him. The third option is much more likely and relies on the idea of collectivism, however is a much more cynical option. The older foods, knowing the truth, may have chosen to perpetuate the myth for the sake of social stability. By teaching younger foods to associate being chosen with joy, rather than terror, they maintained order and competition. Foods strove to be at the front of the shelves, while the elders retreated to the back, relieved to have survived another day. Regardless of the cause, the result was the same. The imagined reality of the Great Beyond became a powerful social truth. As Yuval Noah Harari notes in Sapiens, unlike lying, an imagined reality is something that everyone believes in, and as long as this communal belief persists, The imagined reality exerts force in the world. In Sausage Party, the great beyond exists only because everyone believes in it. That's why Firecracker works so hard to silence truth seekers, because once enough foods begin to question the myth, the entire structure collapses like a poorly stacked house of cards. How can we relate this idea of established fiction and collective memory to the real world? Well, in the real world, imagined realities, fiction and lies are constructed, promoted and accepted to uphold the constructs that most befit the times, or that most befit the agenda of the powerful 1%. The most obvious parallel is religion. Just as the foods are conditioned to believe in the great beyond to shield themselves from the fear of death, humans embrace the concept of an afterlife to find comfort from the unglamorous truth, death and finality. One could argue that such ideas have often been promoted by those in power for their own benefit. For example, during the reign of King James I of Scotland in the mid-1500s, the belief in God helped legitimize the divine right of kings, a political doctrine which asserted that God was ruling the masses through a privileged view. This doctrine justified inequality, greed, genocide, and hypocrisy under the guise of divine order. Unlike King James, however, the non-perishable's creation of the great beyond is not rooted in selfishness. Rather, it is portrayed as a desperate, almost compassionate attempt to bring stability to a terrified community. The lie, though destructive in the long run, emerges as a creative response to chaos, an imagined reality designed not for power, but for peace. While the non-perishables themselves don't have a selfish motive for constructing the myth of the great beyond, the same cannot be said about individual food groups who have subtly and gradually changed the lyrics to the song to reflect their own beliefs about what will happen in the afterlife. Beliefs shaped by the stereotypes, cultural myths, and religious narratives upon which the food groups are modeled off of in real life. For instance, the soy sauce bottles, depicted as representing Chinese culture and Buddhist philosophy, believe they will spend eternity meditating, an obvious nod to Buddhist ideals of spiritual transcendence. The hot dogs and buns, modeled after Western and particularly American culture, imagine that their afterlife will consist of endless indulgence and pleasure, which aligns with Western society's comparatively liberal attitudes towards sex and hedonism. Middle Eastern culture and Islam are represented by Lavash, who believes that he will be rewarded with 72 bottles of virgin olive oil, which humorously mirrors the belief that pious Muslim men will be rewarded with 72 virgins in paradise, a dangerous and misogynistic belief which implies that any woman who does not fit this virginal ideal is somehow less than. The film cleverly mirrors this when Lavash slut-shames Brenda for being out of her package, a metaphor for lost freshness or chastity. And if you think that's bad, the sauerkraut, who represent Germans, alter a line in the song to say, "We'll exterminate the Jews and subjugate the whole damn great beyond," which of course mirrors a Nazi's genocidal mission to exterminate the Jewish population. I think the narrative choice to have the food groups change the lyrics to the songs is a very clever and creative way for the writers to subtly allude to the ways in which religion and culture divide as much as they claim to unite, especially when they are purposefully misinterpreted or taken out of context by power-hungry individuals who cherry-pick parts of religion which best support their mission to marginalize any group they deem unworthy. This can especially be seen with the line, "Everyone else is stupid except for those who think like me." All in all, each food group has its own mythos, conflicts, and views shaped by a convenient rewriting of history, collective memory, and blind faith. Honey Mustard's death marks a pivotal turning point for Frank. Unlike the other foods, he cannot ignore the trauma of what he has witnessed. It propels him to embark on a journey from aisle to aisle in search of Firecracker, and ultimately, the truth. In true hero's journey fashion, Frank faces trials, temptation, and adversaries that test his resolve and deepen his understanding. One such test is his relationship with Brenda, which is strained when she urges him to return to their aisle, find a new package, and resume their old lives. Frank is appalled. He cannot comprehend how she can place faith in comforting lies without evidence. Despite his love for her, he chooses to continue his pursuit of truth, embodying the enlightened ideal of empiricism over emotional security. Frank's quest for the truth mirrors an enlightened approach to knowledge, which emphasizes rationality, reason, individualism, and a steady rejection of traditional authority. If Frank represents this enlightened perspective, then the rest of the foods, in their preference for ignorance and comfort, symbolize a metaphorical dark age, an era defined by fear, conformity, and uncritical belief in inherited truths. Once Frank finds out the truth, he is burdened with the responsibility of revealing it to an unwilling audience. So, how does he do it? How does he manage to topple down centuries of collective fiction? Well, at first, he does a bad job. After locating evidence of the truth, a cookbook showcasing all the horrible ways in which foods will be mutilated to feed human greed, Frank attempts to reveal this to the other foods, who, after displaying an initial shock, refuse to believe him, instead branding him a crazy conspiracy theorist. Those that do believe Frank refuse to cooperate with one another to fight the humans, such as the Old Nuts, a stand-in for Bible-thumping Republican veterans who say they refuse to fight alongside a bunch of fruits, a stand-in for liberal homosexuals. When Frank suggests that they all run away, Ice Cream laments that she can't because she would melt. These exchanges reveal that even when confronted with the truth, most foods prefer denial to the difficult work of unity and action. Frank's condescending tone, calling them a bunch of weak morons, only reinforces their resistance. Salvation comes in the form of Barry, a stunted sausage who was purchased earlier on in the film. Having survived the outside world, Barry returns with other foods who now know the truth. Their presence validates Frank's claims. Together, they expose the great beyond as a lie by drugging the humans in the store, allowing them, while high, to perceive the foods as sentient beings. Horrified, the humans attack, confirming the food's worst fears. This shared crisis finally unites the foods, who put aside their differences and fight back. Barry's return is therefore crucial. Without his first-hand testimony and tangible proof, Frank's warnings would have remained a discredited theory, powerless against centuries of ingrained belief and collective memory. When Frank and Barry reunite, Frank recounts his struggle to Barry. Barry chastises Frank for insulting the other food's belief system, saying, "Of course they didn't listen to you. You just call them a bunch of idiots. You can't slam their beliefs. You gotta show them that there's a better way. You need to inspire them. You need to give them hope." Frank takes this on board, and when he addresses the foods before the fight, his speech feels much more hopeful and inspiring. He tells the foods, "Together we can fight these monsters and take control of our lives and our bodies. We need to unite." What's interesting about Frank's speech is his reliance on age-old universal and timeless ideals such as liberty, freedom, and happiness, all of which are constructs in themselves. As Harari mentions in Sapiens, these principles exist only in the fertile imaginations of sapiens and have no basis in the real world. These constructs are not biological facts or measurable realities. They are fictions that society collectively believe in to maintain cohesion. Therefore, what Frank actually does is substitute one fictional construct with another. This brings to mind Harari's idea that in order to change an existing imagined order, we must believe in an alternate imagined order. Therefore, there is no way out of an order. The fireworks at the end of the movie, which should symbolize the foods having achieved freedom from the fictional constructs that kept them blind to the truth, instead, sinisterly, hail the constructions of new shackles. One might wonder what is so sinister about these new constructs, as freedom, liberty, and happiness are often associated with progress and success. Well, in the sequel to the film, we see that these constructs are taken advantage of by power-hungry individuals, as liberty, freedom, globalization, and unity are quickly replaced with hierarchies, social and economical disparities, subjugation, and further marginalization. Once the humans are defeated, the foods celebrate with a mass orgy. engaging in sexual relations with one another. Food groups that at the beginning of the film couldn't tolerate one another now look beyond their prejudices and unite in enthusiastic and vigorous triumph. However, what this hedonistic ending also tells us is that without religion and order, only chaos, appetite, and base instincts remain. Therefore, the ending can be read as both liberatory or nihilistic. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.